Happy Monday, everyone. For those unfamiliar, my name is Jack Gorsline. I'm the founder of Psychedelic States of America and an investigative reporter covering the politics of drug policy reform, both here in the US and abroad. And this is another edition of the Psychedelic States of America Monday News Roundup. And may the 4th be with you. Although I am not much of a Star Wars guy, I felt it would be inappropriate not to open with that, given the significance of the day. So we will get right into it as we have probably a show that might not go the full half hour, but certainly has no shortage of topics to cover. First up is a number of interesting developments on the state level psychedelic policy front. First thing this morning, my most recent written coverage was published for Filter magazine, newly syndicated at psychedelicamerica's.org, documenting what I think is a really interesting development out of Oklahoma, where the Oklahoma Breakthrough Therapy Act, a clinical trial ibogaine research-focused framework, kind of in line with the broader scope of ibogaine research-focused bills that have been filed in a number of conservative states, and we'll come back to that, but was advanced by the Oklahoma State Senate after previously successfully passing through the Oklahoma House of Representatives, and now heads to Republican Governor Kevin Stitt's desk, awaiting potential signature or veto. While I am not entirely sure where Governor Kevin Stitt stands on psychedelic policy reform at large, the research and private contracts focused drug development, state revenue focused angle that this bill particularly leans into, as have many of the other ibogaine research consortium focused bills that have been filed in conservative states, I think sets it up for a really good opportunity to be seen through and signed into law by Governor Stitt. Obviously, remains to be seen, but with all of the Republican hype following the executive order signed into law by Donald Trump on Saturday, April 18th, it is suffice to say that for Republicans, especially Republican governors that may or may not have their eyes on higher office, pleasing the current administration with support for psychedelic research could be a good play, especially as we enter a number of election years in the next couple of years ahead. So what does this bill actually do? Well, I mentioned it's got the strong research focused component. If signed into law, the bill would direct it would align Oklahoma with the rest of the state level ibogaine research consortium. It started out of Texas and has a number of other states signed on. It would both collaborate with some of those other states on research while also prioritizing access and treatment for specifically ibogaine treatable conditions, mental illnesses, et cetera, for the most vulnerable Oklahoma residents. The idea being that the Oklahoma Department of Health, should this bill be signed into law, would seek to enter into some contracts with drug developers, ideally to bring, again, clinical trial research to, within the borders of Oklahoma and the Panhandle State, if I'm not mistaken, the nickname. And very interestingly, as Joe Moore, founder of Psychedelics Today, and I have discussed previously on this show about various research-focused bills that eventually seek to expand access to direct treatment within state lines and on U.S. soil, this bill includes a professional immunity clause for medical professionals that might be interested post-FDA approval in treating Oklahoman residents with ibogaine for ibogaine-related treatable conditions. So definitely curious to see what happens. The $50 million that the federal government has pledged to dole out to support state-level ibogaine research and clinical trials as enacted through this executive order late last month will certainly play a role in how much funding is put towards clinical trials in the state of Oklahoma. Obviously, a neighboring state to Texas, so the model with which the Texas Ibogaine Initiative is kind of set forth and the multi-site research consortium that currently exists in the state of Texas at a number of phenomenal universities could very well be replicated, from my understanding, in how the Oklahoma ibogaine research process and clinical trial structure is rolled out in conjunction with the Department of Public Health. But it is also worth noting that, again, this private public model seemed to be this incredibly lucrative and thought-provoking model that the Texas Ibogaine Initiative had forged, and then yet, over a year after passage, almost, and the initiative was not able to secure not even, a proposal or an application from a private partner to match the $50 million in state funding. Simply put, because $50 million from private capital or public funding is not nearly enough to conduct the kinds of clinical trials that some of these pharmaceutical companies are looking to do in terms of the scope and the seriousness and the wages, et cetera, all of the infrastructure costs that go into investing in said clinical trials. $50 million was just not a lucrative enough bid for these private companies, these private pharmaceutical partners to get on board with in Texas. So you have to wonder if the model that Governor Kevin Stitt might be signing in the not so distant future has already been proven to struggle to attract private capital and private partners to work directly with the state's Department of Public Health in Texas. Then how can we guarantee that there will be any interest? And point blank, we don't. But the rhetoric win that this signifies in particular, especially as we start to see psychedelics spread further and further across the South, is undeniably important. Whether or not a single dime of private capital or taxpayer funds in Oklahoma goes towards Ibogaine clinical trial research, should it be signed into law or not, certainly remains to be seen and may never happen. But the fact that it has made it this far on its first try, being introduced this session, in itself is a political norm defying development in a plain state where drug policy is certainly not a priority, and if anything, is something that is consistently pushed back against. Oklahoma has a legal cannabis industry. I'm not so sure that the products are the best in the U.S. By any means, but there is a really interesting culture developing in Oklahoma, and I was fortunate enough to speak with and got an exclusive statement from the folks at Oklahoma for Ibogaine, and in particular, military veteran Nate Morgans, who runs the Casey Scud 343 Fund. They are very invested in the future of this movement being led from within their community. So private capital and outside influence aside, the community that exists in Oklahoma that is rallying around this movement certainly does not seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. So worth keeping an eye on. That said, one of the things that I jumped into and contextualized a bit further in my written coverage for Filter Out this morning is the both veto by West Virginia's governor of a very similar Ibogaine research-focused clinical trial-oriented bill, as well as the successful signature of Mississippi's governor, who looks like a cartoon character. If you are not familiar, I would certainly encourage you Googling what the Mississippi governor looks like. Quite an interesting fellow, but he did sign an Ibogaine-focused research bill into law, kind of in line with that Texas, Ibogaine consortium model. And yet it has no appropriations designated in the text of the bill. No funding is currently allocated to support the startup of that program. So much like I've talked about in Connecticut, where there was recently a flurry of media coverage today about the excitement surrounding the possible expansion of this existing pilot program run through Yale in Connecticut, that program hasn't gotten a single dime in appropriations from the state budget in the 3 years that it's currently existed. So an expansion plan sounds nice, right? In theory, they'd be able to treat a lot more people inside the state of Connecticut. We're on the verge of Compass Pathways FDA approval of their COMP360 synthetic psilocybin compound. The idea that you could create something like this and find the funding later is not unreasonable either. But keeping an eye on state budget negotiations in all of these states, especially in red states where the economy is not doing well globally, to put it lightly, and it seems to be affecting the rural South and working class Americans more and more every day as the price of oil goes up, et cetera. There are so many factors politically well beyond the scope of does this politician support psychedelics that far too many people, both state level activists, and national pundits or the advocacy organizing leaders, don't seem to be tracking as closely as they should. And the momentum that has been generated over the last three and a half historic weeks of federal psychedelic policy reform efforts has changed the game as far as where we go next, indisputably. And it is going to be very interesting to see what happens. But factoring in where the global economy is at as far as where the funding actually comes from when it comes to state research, which is arguably more important than ever as the National Science Board is fired and VA funding has already been cut multiple times, and federal research dollars from HHS being pulled away from child cancer research and being put towards things like psychedelics. It is going to be very interesting to see what funding actually ends up being put towards what in the weeks and months and years ahead. So all of that said, another, I guess, brief state level update is that Maryland Governor Wes Moore, largely assumed to be a potential contender for the 2028 Democratic Party's presidential nomination, could very well be president of the United States and leader of the so-called free world someday, signed a psychedelic task force extension bill into law yesterday, which I recently wrote a piece for Lucid News, kind of weighing the pros and cons of psychedelic task force. Joe and I have gotten into it on the show before. I have been mostly skeptical historically, but ultimately what this task force extension represents, based on both speaking with experts in the field and former Maryland residents like Sam Chapman, executive director and founder of the Center for Psychedelic Policy, really sharp guy, spoke with at length about this idea of, are all state level psychedelic task forces created equal? The answer is definitely no, right? There are times where it is little more than a filler and a kicking the can down the road move to create something like this. I know that after the failure of the 2024 psychedelics ballot initiative in Massachusetts, which we will circle back on as I have some news, some updates to share there as far as the investigation of their financial crimes, alleged financial crimes. But the idea of establishing a task force in Massachusetts or filing a task force focused bill was explored shortly, early 2025, and ultimately determined to be something that would really only kick the can, like I said, down the road and delay the possibility of substantive reform, be it a pilot program, be it an actual state regulated access therapeutic program, similar to what New Mexico has done with the New Mexico medical psilocybin program that's currently in its regulatory development phase. And yet at the same time, in defense of state level psychedelic task forces, when progress stalls, be it because of stigma that persists within certain state, legislative offices, lack of support from key bureaucratic agencies within the state government, like the Department of Public Health, or simply put, it just hasn't been a priority to a certain state legislature, certain, governor's mansion in one state or another, to even take a look at drug policy reform as a top 5, top 10, top 15 public policy topic of choice, if you will, focus point. And so the state level psychedelic task force can represent, and often does represent, an opportunity to meet state lawmakers really where they're at. I think we've seen at the federal level the impact of the PATH caucus, the Psychedelic Assisted Therapies caucus being created through the Crenshaw Amendment, I believe, of 2022. It led to the PATH caucus establishing a number of working groups that brought in experts from across the industry, advocacy leaders in multiple different spaces, organizational, directors, et cetera, to develop a series of recommendations for possible psychedelic policy reform pathways at the federal level. And in the wake of those working groups being, held and gathered last year, we have seen 4 really phenomenal and intriguing bills filed at the federal level when it comes to congressional efforts to reform psychedelic policy. And to that note, I teased last week in our live stream that I would be covering the first ever in American history hearing on a standalone psychedelics-focused bill in front of the Senate Veteran Affairs Committee. That was last Wednesday, April 29th in the afternoon, 4 o'clock, which if you're traveling to or from Capitol Hill in the pouring rain is not an ideal time to be going into the Senate, the Russell Senate office buildings. So anyways, I was able to attend and witnessed firsthand generally what the vibe was. There were certainly some heavy advocacy hitters in the building, representatives from all of your favorites, including the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, a number of folks from Clear Mind Medicine, psychedelic biotech company based out of Tel Aviv, obviously advocacy leaders involved and supportive of the veteran community, including the folks from Heroic Hearts Project and the Healing Breakthrough were in attendance. And while the hearing itself, for some additional context, was spread out it was a number of different bills that SVAC, Senate Veteran Affairs Committee, was due to consider this term. And each of those bills got, roughly 5 to 10, sometimes a little bit longer minutes to have a panel of experts answer some questions, and the lawmakers who've introduced or co-sponsored those bills to kind of talk about why it matters to them. And so the VHA, Novel Therapeutics Preparedness Act, which I have covered extensively for Lucid News and a few other outlets at this point, would essentially establish an Office of Novel Therapeutics in the VHA, the Veterans Health Administration, that would convene a council of experts, as well as a number of other advisory boards and structures to rapidly develop best practices and guidelines for both administering psychedelic medicine through VA channels, but potentially to expand said recommendations across the entirety of federal bureaucracy. As I've pointed out previously on this show, the world. So much of drug policy on the international stage is shaped by Indo-European, Western capitalist governmental perspectives on drug policy, and in particular, the United States blueprint of the Controlled Substances Act is been imprinted across any number of free nations in the last half century in particular. And so the ability to craft a uniform set of guidelines, protocol, et cetera, and an established office within one of the few federal agencies that it seems Trump might be willing to divert federal research dollars and funding towards to do something like this, we will certainly find out. Considering the VA has already faced a number of budget cuts that have been devastating for mental health care access for veterans across the country, it remains to be seen if this bill would be something that could actually be a catalyst. And to that point, in attending the hearing, and as noted in my coverage, as well as in the coverage of the great Tom Engel of Marijuana Moment, the panel expert who Senator Ruben Gallego and a number of other SVAC committee members asked some questions to, VA Assistant Undersecretary of Patient Care Services, say that 5 times fast, I dare you, Dr. Mark Kronig, I believe. And it was a very interesting line of questioning. Dr. Kronig was very quick to highlight the VA's already established ketamine treatment programs, where they're currently serving ketamine and esketamine to patients prescribed through VA channels at 53 different VA hospitals or healthcare facilities across the country. We've obviously already seen the designation of a number of fast track breakthrough therapy kind of centers at VA hospitals, including in Brooklyn. I believe it's in the Bronx, Los Angeles, a number of other prominent VA hospitals with, phenomenal psychedelic research already being conducted have been designated as specialty sites to fast track future research. So there is already something of a federal, bureaucratic infrastructure to facilitate the expansion of psychedelic research and treatment, especially as it currently exists within the VA. And Dr. Kronig was very quick to point that out. To which Senator Ruben Gallego, who was one of the co-sponsors of this bill, alongside Senator Tim Sheehy, Republican and U.S. Navy SEAL veteran out of Montana, Gallego was quick to point out that we know where this administration stands on being supportive of psychedelic policy reform. We know that they're on board with the general concept, and that, in theory, given the executive order and the mentioning of the VA in that executive order, along with another of other possible congressional policy pathways that were noted in the text of the EO, that we don't really know where a Democratic administration might stand on psychedelics. I, for one, have a hard time believing that they would be total neo-prohibitionists about the entire prospect of FDA-approved psychedelics or increased access to psychedelic medicine as a legitimate treatment. I also remain skeptical that the Democrats won't, if one, they are to seize the majority of the Senate or the House, or both, in the midterm elections this fall, and or reclaim the White House in 2028. I would not be shocked if we witness a significant backlash against the MAHA movement, the Make America Healthy Again movement at large, in part due to the pharmaceutical influence that oversees and overhangs most of both parties, the uniparty, if you will. But I think in particular, RFK Jr. and some of his, HHS secretary, of course, some of his more outlandish and I think downright unscientific, if you ask me, in my personal opinion, beliefs as far as it comes to vaccines and other issues are just not tenable for the Democratic Party base. So if there were to be a regained majority, I would expect some sort of backlash against the Maha movement to be one of the first points of order from Democratic Congress or White House. One thing I do want to note as we look at 2028 frontrunners, right, for the Democratic Party nomination, we mentioned Governor Wes Moore. I think he's a bit more of a long shot, though I am certainly not a national political pundit, nor am I an expert. But one of the hottest names in politics right now from that particular side of the aisle is former Republican turned Democratic Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who anybody who's been involved in psychedelic advocacy in the last half decade will know vetoed a couple of different psychedelic-related pieces of legislation while, governor. In particular, Newsom vetoed a psychedelic decriminalization bill. He recently signed a research-focused bill spearheaded by the Capones, Amber and Marcus Capone, a number of other parties and supportive veteran advocacy groups that I do think marks some sort of breakthrough progress for California, given the logjam of Newsom's previous vetoes. But what I really want to highlight is that Newsom's been going on press tour, right? He has been all over the podcast scene, as many independent podcasts you think of, a lot of problematic podcasts that he's appeared on, if you ask me, but that's neither here nor there. He's been asked specifically, I'm blanking on which particular comedian-led or, not journalist-led podcast that it was on, but Newsom was asked what his thoughts were on the potential for psychedelic medicine. And despite having vetoed a decriminalization bill, and despite having signed a research-focused, theoretically pharma-friendly bill into law, Gavin Newsom was quick to highlight that he was bullish on the potential, but wary of the influence of big pharma. Definitely a politician's answer, and he is as smooth as they come in the space, and as chameleonic, if you will. Definitely not a word, but we're rolling with it. As far as how he shifts and moves and adapts his public policy stances based on the interests of special interest groups, high-level donors, political action committees, etc., but also based on the whims of the American voter. And as psychedelics have now entered the mainstream, given he's both aware of and dually supportive, bullish and skeptical all at once, it seems, of the issue from multiple angles, I would expect psychedelics to be something that is fair game to ask Gavin Newsom about and press Gavin Newsom on the clarification of his particular stance in the future of psychedelic policy reform. Coming up on time, so I want to be conscious of that. And then, like I said, I'm not sure that we'll make it to the full half hour, but one thing I do really find it important to highlight, as I reported over the weekend and highlighted in PSA's Sunday Sound Off newsletter yesterday, is that late last week I was able to obtain internal communications from the Massachusetts Office of Campaign and Political Finance, which has been dutifully investigating the 2024 Yes on 4 psychedelic ballot initiative that would have both dually legalized psychedelic-assisted therapy as well as decriminalized the personal use and home cultivation of a number of naturally occurring psychedelic compounds, fungi, and plants. It was unsuccessful. Anybody who has read any of my coverage is probably aware that it was unsuccessful. And when dug into a little bit further, I was able to uncover a pretty significant scope of alleged campaign finance violations, including the establishment of an organization formerly known, I guess as they no longer exist, as Open Circle Alliance, which was a nonprofit to be that never ended up actually filing, but was created and, I believe, formally established in April of 2024 after, by the admission of a number of campaign officials, one of the co-founders, one Stephanie Jones, formerly of a number of prominent psychedelic advocacy organizations, as well as Lockheed Martin employee and non-veteran Rebecca Slater, as well as the campaign director, grassroots campaign director for the S14 campaign, U.S. Navy veteran Emily Onischuk, were introduced by New Approach PAC and New Approach Advocacy Fund operative, contract for hire, Jared Moffitt. By that collective of individuals' own admission, they were introduced and inspired, quote unquote, to create Open Circle Alliance, which, again, by their own admission, in publicly documented reporting that I would encourage everybody to read were supposedly going to be the quote unofficial education arm of the Question 4 campaign. The two of the co-founders, Stephanie Jones and Rebecca Slater, were given pretty lucrative $55,000 each contracts with the Heroic Hearts Project that lasted 7 months, expiring just shortly after Election Day 2024, in which those contracts laid out purportedly that they would be conducting a number of educational outreach efforts and using Open Circle Alliance essentially as a vessel to support educational outreach surrounding psychedelics and psychedelic use in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, both in relation to the campaign and not, as has been a consistent defense. Now, why does any of this matter? And why am I mentioning 11 months after the complaints were first filed in June of last year that this investigation is ongoing? It is pretty undeniable by any psychedelic policy expert's own admission, if you ask them, that had the Question 4 campaign passed, the viability of decriminalization of psychedelics or certain psychedelics at the state level would increase exponentially as a policy priority, not only in that little pocket of progressive states in New England, but potentially across the country, given Massachusetts' reputation as a bellwether and sort of a testing ground for next-gen progressive policy reform concepts taking the national leap. I will not get into the history of that now, but look back on some of my previous comments on Massachusetts history and you'll get what I mean. The line of defense, I guess the narrative spin that a number of the accused parties involved in this scandal decided to run with in the immediate wake of reporting just the existence of these allegations of pretty significant, over $500,000, potentially over, allegedly potentially over $1 million of campaign finance violations by some pretty heavy hitters. New Approach PAC, the largest single organizational investor in drug policy reform in U.S. history, Heroic Hearts Project, and obviously a very widely respected veterans advocacy organization that gave combined $120,000 to these two white ladies from the suburbs of Massachusetts that, to be frank, had no history of military experience between them. From my understanding, on Heroic Hearts Project's own website, it costs $6,000 a donation to sponsor a veteran to go on a psychedelic retreat abroad and heal. And so the cost of about 20 psychedelic retreats for veterans was invested in this shell group, right? These two non-veterans doing educational outreach work. And in the 18-month, or so scope of their organizational existence, Open Circle Alliance only really managed to host 4 public events. And they accumulated 49 Instagram followers and posted twice on Instagram. Does that sound worth $120,000 plus to you? I know a lot of small nonprofit advocacy groups across the United States and around the world could completely elevate their operation with $120K. Let me tell you. And so what is so concerning to so many activists across the space that I've spoken to as they've reviewed the complaints as filed and the evidence that I've compiled supporting the possibility these allegations are probably true based on legal counsel I've spoken to with expertise in this field of campaign finance in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It reeks of a lack of care for the communities that are in the trenches doing this work from national organizations. It reeks of a lack of real institutional backbone to stand and speak for, and really support through actions and not just words, the priorities of a campaign like this. And it speaks to a lack of accountability across the entirety of the psychedelic renaissance as it exists as a political movement in the US, because many of the individuals directly involved in, the pretty sloppy execution of this campaign, if you look at the internal comms that have been leaked, have not been held accountable for the pretty egregious mishandling, both of, again, seemingly well over $500,000 in campaign finance funds, but also the continued perpetuation and platforming of these individuals who ran, frankly, like a pretty awful campaign as supposed psychedelic policy experts and people that should be consulted and working on these campaigns. So ultimately, I would say I leave it up to the activists and the advocacy leaders who review the scope of the allegations made to decide whether or not accountability should be wrought upon the accused parties. But Nevertheless, when your primary narrative spin in defense of egregious and seemingly fairly blatant campaign finance violations in the $1 million or more range is there's nothing to see here. We stand by our record of compliance. And oh, by the way, the ex-employees who turned whistleblowers, who were our staffers, they're just crazy. You shouldn't listen to them. To hear that be the narrative that was spun just 11 months ago, to then be on the road over the last couple of weeks and hear from folks that have been inside some of these conversations, or hearing how the evolving narrative has been spun. The new kind of standing line seems to be, well, so what? Even if they did, even if so and so did cross the 20% political donations limit for a 501c3, or so and so did handle this money irresponsibly or commit wire fraud by having employees sign fraudulent contracts to give them campaign related bonuses through a non-political entity. Those are allegations that are taken lightly by the OCPF, and if there's nothing to them, you got to wonder, why would it take 11 months to review these allegations in full? Why would it take 11 months to carry on an investigation like this across two different legal counsel representatives from the OCPF who've separately been reviewing the claims? And as we've seen a number of 2024 investigations, related to political finance, crimes having been resolved by the OCPF in recent months, my gut feeling and my instinct, and based on the sources I've spoken to with direct knowledge of how these investigative processes carry out at the state level, as well as with direct knowledge of the evolving narrative that's been spun by the accused parties, I think we are due for a very interesting ruling on the alleged financial crimes, possibly some fines, possibly some revealing of donor lists in full for organizations that may have concealed them through their political allegiances and through the way that they supported the campaign fiscally. I expect that we will have a ruling before the end of this year. So I have rambled far too long about the Question 4 campaign over the last 11 months. I know that there are a number of readers and listeners and viewers and supporters of Psychedelic States of America at large that are certainly ready for me to move on. But the existence of an ongoing investigation 11 months after these complaints were lodged is undeniably newsworthy, given the true multi-generational impact that the abysmal failure of the Question 4 campaign has had on the future of the movement and the ability to prioritize decriminalization of psychedelics as a policy priority at the state or the federal level, which it does not seem likely to be able to be revisited as a serious policy talking point or focus point for at least a half decade or more. So that's all I've got. And I so appreciate all of you who've tuned in today. We'll get working on getting some clips out of this, and I'll be back on Friday for another iteration of the PSA Friday News Roundup. More to come in the days ahead as far as future coverage and federal psychedelic policy developments. But until next time, I'm Jack Gorsline, and we'll see you soon.